When her marriage ended at 19, she was left with nothing but a key to a forgotten family farm. What she discovered there wasn't an escape, but a debt she never knew she owed, and a choice that would redefine her life forever. If you've ever had to start over from absolute zero, if you've ever felt like the world had left you behind, this story is for you. Hit that subscribe button because we're going to walk through this together. It all started on the last day of my old life. The air in the car was thick with the smell of cheap air freshener and the stale finality of words that couldn't be unsaid. I sat there, parked on a nondescript suburban street, the engine off, the quiet buzzing in my ears. The key to the ignition felt cold and alien in my hand, just another object that didn't really belong to me anymore. Outside, the sky was the color of a bruise, a flat, indifferent gray that promised rain. It was October. My whole world had shrunk to the contents of this 10-year-old sedan. 2 cardboard boxes of clothes, a shoebox of photos I couldn't bring myself to throw away, and a sleeping bag. I was 19 years old, and my husband of 14 months had just informed me with the sterile precision of a surgeon delivering a terminal diagnosis that my presence in his life was no longer required. His parents were selling the condo. He was moving on. The conversation hadn't been a fight. Fights have heat, passion. This was an eviction notice. "I just don't see a future here, Alara," Mark had said, his eyes fixed on a point somewhere over my shoulder. He'd already packed my things. It was efficient, I had to give him that. He was always efficient. I stared at the passenger seat, at the small manila envelope he'd handed me as a parting gift. It contained $500 in cash and a single tarnished brass key. "Your grandmother's place," he'd said, as if that explained everything. "The lawyer called my dad a while back. It's yours now, I guess. It's probably a teardown, but it's something." Something. He said it with a faint curl of his lip, the same one he used when he saw a stray dog or a piece of trash on the sidewalk. Pity mixed with disgust. I hadn't seen my grandmother in the 5 years before she died. We'd grown distant after my parents' divorce, after my father disappeared from my life, and my mother moved us 3 states away to start over. Grandma June had stayed on her farm, a place that existed more in my memory as a sun-drenched photograph than a real location. I remembered the smell of turned earth and baking bread, the rough feel of her calloused hands, the low hum of her voice reading stories on the porch swing. After she passed 2 years ago, I'd received a sympathy card from a lawyer I didn't know, but I was in the whirlwind of planning a wedding to a man I thought was my future, and I'd filed it away, another piece of a past I was trying to outrun. Now that past was all I had left. The key was heavy in my palm. It was ornate, old-fashioned, with a complex, almost floral head. It felt like a prop from a fairy tale, a stark contrast to the flimsy, generic key to the condo I'd just placed on the counter. One key opened a box I was forced out of. This one opened a question mark. I had no idea where the farm even was, not really. Somewhere north, in the part of the state people called the Sticks. I had a vague memory of a town called Sparrow Creek. I turned the ignition. The engine coughed to life, a rattling, uncertain sound that felt like a perfect match for the state of my own heart. For the first hour, I just drove. No destination, just the need for motion, for the illusion of progress. The manicured lawns of the suburbs bled into the strip malls of the exurbs, and then finally, reluctantly, into stretches of brown, harvested fields. Each mile felt like it was putting a layer of insulation between me and the raw, hollowed-out feeling in my chest. The first night, I slept in the parking lot of a 24-hour supermarket. I reclined the driver's seat as far as it would go and wrapped myself in the sleeping bag, the synthetic fabric cool against my skin. Every pair of headlights that swept across the parking lot felt like an accusation. I felt the vulnerability in my bones, the sheer, terrifying transparency of being a woman alone in a car. I thought about the warmth of my bed, the weight of a blanket, the simple security of a locked door. Things I had taken for granted only yesterday. Now, they felt like unimaginable luxuries. The institutional gray of the parking lot lights seeped through the windows, casting everything in a lifeless, clinical glow. It reminded me of a hospital waiting room. I suppose that's what I was doing. Waiting. For what, I had no idea. The next 2 days were a blur of gas station coffee and protein bars. I used public restrooms to wash my face. The cold water a brief, sharp shock that reminded me I was still real. I drove aimlessly, tracing forgotten highways on a worn paper map. The GPS on my phone, a luxury I couldn't afford to use with my dwindling battery. The $500 felt like both a fortune and nothing at all. It was a countdown timer. Every dollar spent on gas or a hot meal was a tick of the clock, bringing me closer to absolute zero. The world felt sharp and hostile. People's glances lingered a little too long. I was hyper-aware of my messy hair, my wrinkled clothes, the faint but persistent sense that I was out of place everywhere. I was a ghost, haunting the edges of other people's normal lives. On the third day, parked by a small lake, watching the wind ripple across the water, my phone rang. It was an unknown number with a local area code from my hometown. I almost ignored it. It could be Mark, calling to tie up some loose end, a final twist of the knife. But something made me answer. Hello? My voice was raspy. Am I speaking with Elara Vance? The voice on the other end was male, calm, and measured. It was a voice that was used to being in control. This is she. Ms. Vance, my name is Arthur Davies. I was the executor of your grandmother's estate, June Alistair. I'm sorry to be calling out of the blue. I've been trying to reach you for some time. I spoke with a Mr. Mark Stanton's father, who gave me this number. My stomach tightened. The lawyer from the sympathy card. Yes, I remember your name. Good. Well, I won't keep you. As you may or may not be aware, your grandmother left her property, the farm at 417 Sparrow Creek Road, to you in her will. It is now legally yours. He said it so matter-of-factly, as if he were telling me the time. Legally mine. A piece of the earth with a house on it. The idea was so immense, so foreign, it didn't compute. Okay, I said, the only word I could manage. There are, however, some complications. Of course there were. I felt a dry, humorless laugh bubble in my throat. The property has several outstanding tax liens against it, totaling a little over $12,000. If they aren't settled, the county will seize the property in a foreclosure auction. $12,000. He might as well have said 12 million. It was an impossible, astronomical sum. The $500 in the envelope suddenly felt like a handful of pennies. I see, I whispered. Furthermore, he continued, his tone unchanging, we have received a standing offer on the property from a corporation called Pioneer Holdings. They're a development firm that has been acquiring land in that region. Their offer is for $300,000, contingent on a clear title. They've offered to absorb the tax debt as part of the purchase. My mind went blank. $300,000. The number hung in the air, shimmering and unreal. It was a life raft. It was an escape. It was a ticket to a new life, a clean break, an apartment of my own, a future that didn't involve sleeping in a car. "The offer is only on the table for the next 30 days, Ms. Vance," Mr. Davies said, his voice pulling me back from the dizzying possibility. "After that, they will retract it and likely wait for the foreclosure auction where they could acquire it for much less." A ticking clock, a choice. Sell this place I'd never seen, this piece of a past I barely knew, and walk away with a fortune. Or what? Let it be seized by the county for a debt I could never pay. The choice seemed obvious. It seemed insane to even consider anything else. "I also have a box of your grandmother's personal effects," he added, almost as an afterthought. "She left it with me specifically for you. It contains some letters. She was very insistent that you receive it before making any decisions about the farm. Shall I have it couriered to you?" Letters. The word snagged in my mind. Why would she leave letters? Why the insistence that I see them first? A sliver of unease cut through the dazzling allure of the money. It felt like a warning. "Yes," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "Yes, please." I gave him the address of a small post office in a town a few hours north, a place I'd picked at random on the map. A place that was, I realized, in the general direction of Sparrow Creek. I didn't know why. It wasn't a conscious decision, it was just a pull, a faint magnetic north I hadn't known I was following. After the call ended, I sat in the silence of the car for a long time. The water in the lake was dark and deep. $300,000. I could be free. I could leave this whole sorry chapter behind me, erase the humiliation, the poverty, the fear. I could buy a new car, a new wardrobe, a new identity. I could be someone else, somewhere else. But then I looked at the old brass key, still sitting on the passenger seat. It wasn't just a key to a rundown house anymore. It was a key to a story. And for the first time in a very long time, I felt a flicker of something that wasn't fear or despair. It was curiosity. The package arrived 2 days later. It was heavier than I expected. The postal clerk, a woman with kind, tired eyes, helped me carry it to my car. There was a thick legal envelope, which I set aside, and a wooden box about the size of a microwave. It was dark, polished wood, with dovetailed corners and a simple brass latch. It felt ancient and important. I drove to a nearby state park, found a secluded picnic table under a canopy of whispering pines, and set the box down. The air smelled of damp earth and pine needles. For a moment, I just looked at it. This was a direct link to a woman I barely remembered, a message sent across time and death. My hands trembled slightly as I worked the latch. It opened with a soft, woody click. The inside was lined with faded blue velvet. The scent that rose from it was a complex blend of dried lavender, old paper, and something else, something uniquely her. It was the scent of her house, a scent I hadn't realized I remembered until that exact moment. On top lay a small embroidered pouch filled with dried flowers. Beneath it was a stack of letters, maybe a dozen of them, tied together with a faded silk ribbon. And under the letters, something that made my breath catch. It was a photograph. A young woman with my eyes and my smile stood proudly in front of the farmhouse, her hands on her hips. A man stood beside her, his arm around her waist, a goofy, love-struck grin on his face. It was my grandmother and grandfather, but behind them, leaning against the porch railing, was a teenage boy with a familiar, brooding look. My father. He looked so young, so full of a life I'd never known. The farm in the picture was vibrant. The paint was fresh, the windows gleamed, and the fields behind it were green and full. It wasn't a teardown. It was a home, a thriving, happy home. I put the picture aside and picked up the legal envelope from Mr. Davies. Inside was a mountain of paperwork, deeds, tax assessments, and at the front, the official offer from Pioneer Holdings. The letterhead was sleek and corporate. The language was dense and intimidating. But the number was right there in black and white, $300,000. It was real. I folded the letter and put it back in the envelope. Then I turned my attention back to the box. I untied the silk ribbon. The letters were in different types of envelopes, some crisp, some yellowed with age. On the very top of the stack was a single, unsealed envelope with my name, Ilara, written in a familiar, elegant script, my grandmother's handwriting. I pulled the pages out. They were filled with that same script, the ink slightly faded. I took a deep breath and began to read. "My dearest Ilara," it began. "If you are reading this, it means I am gone, and it means you are at a crossroads. I hope with all my heart that you are reading this in a time of peace and happiness. But my old bones tell me that is likely not the case. I know the man you married, or at least his type. I saw it in his eyes the one time I met him. The same look of casual ownership your grandfather had before I taught him better. I fear he is a man who takes, and you, my dear girl, have always been a giver." The words were a punch to the gut. She had seen it. In one meeting, she had seen what it took me a year of marriage to understand. I felt a hot flush of shame, followed by a wave of profound, aching love. She had known. "I am not writing to say, 'I told you so,'" the letter continued. "Life is too short for such pettiness. I am writing to tell you a story, the story of this farm and the story of the debt you now hold. I know Mr. Davies will have told you about the money, about the offer from Pioneer. It must seem like a miracle, a way out of whatever trouble you are in. And it can be, if that is what you choose. There is no shame in taking it. But you cannot make a choice without knowing the true cost." I leaned forward, my elbows on the rough wood of the picnic table, the world narrowing to the words on the page. "The tax debt Mr. Davies told you about is real, but it is only the tip of the iceberg. Years ago, long after your grandfather passed, and just before your father left, I took out a massive loan against this land, a second mortgage. It was a terrible risk, one that has haunted my every waking moment since. I did it to cover a debt, not my debt, your father's." I stopped reading, my heart pounding. My father. The official story was that he'd just left, that he couldn't handle the responsibility of being a husband and a father, and had simply vanished, a ghost in our family history. He got himself into trouble, Ilara, the kind of trouble that doesn't just go away. He fell in with some very bad people, made some foolish choices, chasing a dream of easy money. They were going to hurt him. Worse, they were going to hurt you and your mother. He came to me, broken and terrified. He had nowhere else to turn. I could picture it. My father, who I remembered as distant and quiet, coming back to this house, to his mother, admitting his failure. The shame he must have felt. "I paid it," she wrote. "I took the equity out of this land, this soil your great-grandfather broke his back to claim, and I gave it to monsters to make them go away. It was the only way to keep him safe, to keep you safe. The plan was for him to stay, to work the farm with me, to pay it back over time. But the shame was too much for him. A week later, he was gone. He couldn't face me. He couldn't face what he'd done. He chose to disappear rather than live with the weight of his mistake. And I let him go. Perhaps that was my mistake. I had to put the letter down. The air felt thin. I squeezed my eyes shut, but the image of the photograph was burned into my mind. My father, as a boy, leaning against that porch, a whole life ahead of him. The narrative of my life had just been violently rewritten. He hadn't abandoned us out of selfishness. He had been broken. And my grandmother, the quiet, steady woman from my childhood memories, had performed an act of fierce, secret sacrifice. She hadn't withered away in poverty. She had chosen it. She had traded her financial security for our safety. So you see, my dear, this farm is not just land and buildings, the letter concluded. It is the physical manifestation of a debt of love. Selling it to Pioneer Holdings would clear the financial slate. It would give you a new start, and I would not blame you for a second if you took it. But I wanted you to know what it was you were selling. You would not just be selling a piece of dirt. You would be selling my sacrifice, his shame, the last tangible piece of our family's complicated, messy, beautiful story. The choice is yours, and yours alone. Whatever you do, know that I love you. Always. Your Grandma June. I folded the letter, my fingers stiff and cold. The pine trees swayed above me, their needles whispering in a language I didn't understand. The $300,000 no longer seemed like a life raft. It felt like blood money. The weight of it all crashed down on me. The grief for a grandmother I never truly knew. The sudden, complicated pity for a father I had only ever resented. The crushing burden of a choice I never asked for. I sat at that picnic table until the sun began to dip below the trees, casting long, dramatic shadows across the ground. Then, I carefully placed the letter back in the box, closed the lid, and carried it back to my car. I still had the key. I still had a quarter tank of gas. And for the first time, I had a destination. The drive to Sparrow Creek was a journey through a forgotten America. The highways gave way to two-lane county roads, the asphalt cracked and patched. The towns grew smaller, the spaces between them wider. I passed rusted-out tractors sitting like sleeping giants in fields, mailboxes shaped like cows, and peeling signs advertising local diners and bait shops. It was a world away from the polished, anonymous suburbs where I'd lived with Mark. It felt older, slower, more real. I arrived at the turnoff for Sparrow Creek Road just as dusk was settling, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and soft orange. The sign was wooden and weathered, the letters faded. The road itself was more of a gravel track, flanked by dense woods. My car's tires crunched over the loose stones, the sound loud in the evening quiet. After about a mile, I saw it, a rusted metal gate hanging slightly askew from a stone pillar. Beyond it, a long, overgrown lane disappeared into the trees. This was it. I got out of the car and walked to the gate. It was held shut by a heavy chain and a padlock, both dark with rust. For a panicked moment, I thought I was stuck. But then I saw it. The padlock wasn't locked. The chain was just looped through. My hands shook as I unhooked the heavy links. The gate groaned in protest as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the stillness. I drove the car through and pulled over, getting out to close the gate behind me. It felt like a significant act, closing a door on the outside world. The lane was even more overgrown than it had looked from the road. Weeds grew tall in the center, and branches from the trees on either side scraped against the car's roof. It felt like I was driving through a tunnel, a passage into another time. And then, the tunnel opened up, and I saw the house. It stood on a slight rise, silhouetted against the last light of the day. It was exactly as it had appeared in the photograph, but decades older, wearier. The white paint was peeling in long strips, revealing the weathered gray wood beneath. The porch sagged on one side. Several shingles were missing from the roof. It looked sad and abandoned, a house that was grieving. But it was also beautiful. It had a simple, sturdy grace to it. It had good bones. I parked the car and walked toward it, my boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. The air was cool and clean, smelling of wet leaves and wood smoke from some distant chimney. The silence was absolute, broken only by the chirp of a lone cricket. I climbed the 3 steps to the porch, each one groaning under my weight. The front door was a deep, faded blue. The brass doorknob was tarnished, but the keyhole looked clean. I pulled the key from my pocket. It slid into the lock with a smooth, satisfying click. I turned it. The mechanism inside tumbled, a sound that seemed to echo back through the years. I pushed the door open. A wave of cool, musty air washed over me. It was the smell from the box, but stronger, richer. The smell of dust, of time, of lavender, of home. The interior was dark, a landscape of shapes draped in white sheets, like a room full of ghosts. I stepped inside and closed the door behind me. The click of the latch was deafening. I was alone, but for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel lost. I felt like I had arrived. The first thing I did was walk through the house, pulling the sheets off the furniture one by one. Each unveiling was a revelation. A sturdy oak dining table, a plush, overstuffed armchair with a worn spot on the armrest where my grandmother must have rested her elbow. A tall bookshelf filled with paperbacks, their spines cracked and faded. It was like waking a sleeping giant. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of moonlight slanting through the grimy windows. I ran my hand over the dusty surface of the dining table. This was where they ate. This was where they talked, argued, laughed. This was where my father sat as a boy. The house was a silent witness to it all. I brought my meager belongings in from the car, the boxes of clothes, the sleeping bag. I put the wooden box from my grandmother on the center of the dining table. It felt like it belonged there. That night, I didn't sleep in the car. I spread my sleeping bag on the floor of what I assumed was the main bedroom. The mattress on the bed was probably a lost cause, but the floor was solid oak. Through the window I could see 1,000,000 stars, more than I had ever seen in my life. The city's glow was a world away. There was no hum of traffic, no distant sirens, just the vast, profound silence of the country. And in that silence, I felt the full weight of my grandmother's letter, her sacrifice, my father's shame, the choice that now lay before me. I could call Mr. Davies in the morning, tell him to accept the offer. By this time next month, I could be in a new city, in a new apartment, with a bank account that would make me forget the feeling of sleeping in a car. I could buy a whole new life. Or I could stay. I could stay here, in this dusty, dying house, and try to fight for it. For a legacy I didn't know I had. For a woman whose love was bigger than I could comprehend. It was an insane thought. I had no money, no skills, no idea how to run a farm, or even fix a leaky faucet. Pioneer Holdings was a corporation. I was a 19-year-old girl with a broken heart and a 10-year-old car. It was an impossible fight. And yet, lying there on the floor, in the heart of my grandmother's house, the thought of selling it felt like a physical betrayal. It felt like taking her love and her sacrifice and putting a price tag on it. It felt like agreeing with Mark that this place, this history, was just a teardown. something to be bulldozed to make way for something new and sterile and profitable. I fell asleep with the question echoing in my mind, and I dreamed of green fields and a house with light pouring from every window. The next morning, I woke up stiff and cold, but resolute. I found a rusty hand pump in the backyard, and after a few minutes of agonizing squealing and clanking, it coughed up a stream of clear, ice-cold water. I washed my face in it, the shock of the cold making me feel alive and awake. I spent the day exploring. The house was bigger than I remembered. 3 bedrooms upstairs, a small study filled with books on agriculture and botany, and a kitchen with an ancient-looking stove. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, but underneath it was solid, well-made, cared for. Outside was even more daunting. A large red barn stood behind the house, its roof sagging in the middle. Inside it smelled of hay and rust. A hulking, dinosaur-like tractor sat in the gloom, covered in cobwebs. There were sheds, a chicken coop with the door hanging off one hinge, and fields stretching out in every direction, choked with weeds and brambles. It was a ruin, a beautiful, sprawling ruin. But it was my ruin. Back in the house, I sat at the dining table and opened the wooden box again. I needed to know more. I sorted through the other letters. Most were old correspondence, letters from friends, postcards from trips taken long ago. But then I found another envelope, thicker than the rest, with no name on it. I opened it. Inside were not letters, but documents. The original loan agreement for the second mortgage, bank statements showing the withdrawal, and tucked in the back, a single sheet of folded paper. It was a list of names, and next to each name, a note. Lost his farm, 2008. Forced to sell below market, 2010. Signed over water rights under duress. At the bottom of the page, in my grandmother's shaky hand, were 2 words: Pioneer Holdings. My blood ran cold. This wasn't just a list, this was evidence. My grandmother hadn't just been sitting here, waiting for the end. She had been fighting. She had been gathering intelligence. She knew they were predators. She was building a case. And then I found the last thing in the envelope. It was a passbook for a savings account at a small local credit union. The name on the account was June Alistair. I opened it. The last entry was dated a week before she died. The balance was $15,000. Enough to pay the back taxes. Enough to live on for a few months. Enough to start. It wasn't a burden she had left me. It was an arsenal. She had given me the story, the evidence, and the means. She had given me everything I needed to make a real choice. Right there, in that cold, dusty house, I felt completely broken and completely whole at the same time. Have you ever been hit with a truth so big it rewrites your entire past? A truth that shows you that what you thought was abandonment was actually protection. It's a feeling that can either crush you or forge you into something new. It's a moment that defines you. If you've ever had a moment like that, a moment that changed everything, I want to hear about it. Let me know in the comments. Your story matters. We're building a community here for people who understand that the deepest wounds can lead to the greatest strength. Now, let's get back to what I did next, because that passbook wasn't just money. It was a declaration of war. I stared at the passbook, at the neat column of figures, at the final steady number. $15,000. It was a fortune. It was a lifeline. But more than that, it was a message. It was my grandmother's final word. It wasn't run. It was fight. I picked up my phone. The battery was low, but I had enough. I found the number for Mr. Davies. I took a breath. the air thick with the smell of dust and determination, and I dialed. He answered on the second ring, his voice as calm and steady as ever. "Mr. Davies, it's Elara Vance." "Miss Vance, good to hear from you. Have you had a chance to consider the offer from Pioneer Holdings? The deadline is approaching." "I have," I said, and my own voice surprised me. It was clear. It was firm. It didn't tremble. "Please inform them that I am rejecting their offer." There was a pause on the other end of the line. For the first time, I thought I could hear a crack in his professional composure, a hint of surprise. "Ms. Vance, are you certain? It's a very generous offer. The tax situation is quite serious." "I'm certain," I said. "I'm not selling. I'm going to pay the back taxes. The money is in an account at the Sparrow Creek Credit Union." Another pause, longer this time. "I see," he said slowly. "Well, that is certainly your prerogative. I will inform Pioneer Holdings of your decision. Be prepared, Ms. Vance. They are not accustomed to being told no." "I'm prepared," I lied. I wasn't prepared for anything, but saying the words made me feel a little stronger. "Thank you for your help, Mr. Davies." "Of course," he said, and his voice had a new note in it. It wasn't pity. It sounded, strangely, like respect. "Call me if you need anything." I hung up the phone and sat in the echoing silence of the house. I had done it. I had thrown the gauntlet down. I had chosen the impossible fight. A wave of pure, terrifying panic washed over me. What had I just done? I had turned down a fortune, a new life, for a pile of rotting wood and barren fields. I was a fool. A romantic, sentimental fool. I put my head in my hands, the weight of my decision pressing down on me. I was in over my head, a child playing at being an adult. But then I looked at my grandmother's letter, at the list of names she had compiled. I thought of her, alone in this house, fighting a quiet, lonely war against a faceless corporation. She hadn't given up. How could I? I stood up. The panic receded, replaced by a cold, clear sense of purpose. I had a house to clean. I had a life to build. The first week was a blur of grueling, back-breaking labor. I started with the house. I found cleaning supplies under the sink that were probably older than I was, but the bleach still smelled like bleach. I scrubbed floors on my hands and knees, the grime coming away in black streaks, revealing the beautiful, warm wood underneath. I washed every single window, inside and out, until the sunlight poured into the rooms, chasing the shadows from the corners. I beat the dust out of rugs in the yard, sending up great clouds that looked like smoke signals. Every muscle in my body screamed in protest. My hands were raw and blistered. At night, I would collapse into my sleeping bag, too tired to even dream. But every morning, I woke up to a house that was a little brighter, a little cleaner, a little more alive. I was not just cleaning a house, I was reclaiming it. During that first week, I made the trip into Sparrow Creek. It was less a town and more a crossroads with a post office, a gas station that doubled as a general store, and a small diner. The credit union was a small brick building with a friendly teller who helped me access my grandmother's account and transfer the funds to pay the county tax office. As I left, holding the receipt that proved the farm was truly mine, I felt a sense of victory so profound it almost brought me to my knees. I bought groceries at the general store. The man behind the counter, a burly man with a kind face and a name tag that read George, looked at me with open curiosity. "You're June's granddaughter, aren't you?" he asked, his voice a low rumble. I nodded, surprised. "I'm Elara." "George," he said, sticking a thick hand over the counter for me to shake. "Knew your grandmother my whole life. Stubbornest woman I ever met. Heard you told Pioneer to take a hike. News traveled fast in a town this small. I did, I said. He grinned, a wide, genuine smile. Good for you, he said, ringing up my items. About time someone stood up to those vultures. June would be proud. He threw in an extra apple. On the house, he said with a wink. Welcome home. I walked out of the store feeling like I could fly. I wasn't just a stranger here. I was June's granddaughter. I had a place. I had a history. The letter from Pioneer Holdings arrived a few days later. It was delivered by a courier, a man in a crisp uniform who looked deeply uncomfortable coming down my overgrown lane. The envelope was thick, creamy cardstock. The letter inside was polite, professional, and utterly menacing. They acknowledged my rejection of their previous offer. They were now prepared to offer $400,000. They considered this their final offer. They also gently reminded me of the costs of maintaining a property of that size, the liabilities, the difficulty of turning a profit in modern agriculture. It was an offer wrapped in a threat. They weren't just trying to buy my land. They were trying to intimidate me, to make me feel small and foolish and in over my head. And it almost worked. The number was staggering, $400,000. It was a ridiculous amount of money. The responsible, logical thing to do was to take it. But I folded the letter, slid it back into its expensive envelope, and threw it on the pile of wood I was collecting for the fireplace. That evening, as I was trying to figure out how to light the ancient wood-burning stove in the kitchen, there was a knock on the door. I froze. The courier was one thing. An unexpected visitor at dusk was another. I grabbed the heaviest frying pan I could find and crept to the door. "Hello?" I called out, my voice trembling slightly. "Evenin'," a gruff voice answered. "Name's Henderson. I live down the road. Saw your lights on. Just wanted to make sure everything was all right." I peered through the small window in the door. An old man in overalls stood on my porch, his face deeply lined, a battered cap on his head. He looked more like a garden gnome than a threat. I opened the door. "I'm all right," I said. "Just moving in." He nodded, his eyes scanning the porch, the peeling paint, the sagging roofline. "Heard you were June's girl," he said. "She was a good neighbor, a good woman." He pointed a gnarled finger toward the barn. "That old tractor in there, that a John Deere 4020? "I have no idea," I admitted. "It's a green thing with big wheels." He chuckled, a dry, rattling sound. "That's the one. Thing hasn't run in years, but it's a workhorse. Engine's probably seized up, but I bet I could get it going for you." I stared at him. "Why would you do that?" He shrugged, kicking at a loose board on the porch. "Because June would have done the same for me, and because I'd rather see this place breathing again than see it bulldozed for a bunch of cookie-cutter houses with no yards." He tipped his cap. "I'll come by tomorrow morning. We'll see what we can do." He turned and walked off into the twilight, leaving me standing in the doorway, the heavy frying pan still in my hand. I wasn't alone in this fight. The next morning, true to his word, Mr. Henderson showed up with a toolbox that looked like it had survived a war. We spent the entire day in the barn. He was a man of few words, but he was a patient teacher. He showed me how to check the oil, how to clean a spark plug, how to make sense of the tangled mess of wires and hoses. He smelled of grease and tobacco, and he swore creatively at stubborn bolts. By the end of the day, my hands were black with grease, and I had learned more about internal combustion engines than I had in my entire life. As the sun set, he wiped his hands on a rag. "All right," he said, "give her a try." I climbed up into the high metal seat. It felt like ascending a throne. I turned the key. The engine sputtered. It coughed. It let out a groan of protest. And then, with a deafening roar, it caught. It roared to life, shaking the entire barn, belching a cloud of black smoke that soon cleared. The sound was the most beautiful thing I had ever heard. It was the sound of hope. Mr. Henderson grinned, a rare, full-toothed smile. "Told you," he said. "She's got life in her yet." The months that followed were the hardest and best of my life. The work was endless. With Mr. Henderson's help, I learned to drive the tractor. I bought a brush hog attachment and began the monumental task of clearing the fields. It was slow, brutal work. I fought back against acres of thorny brambles and thickets of weeds that were as tall as I was. Some days I would work until I couldn't lift my arms, and it felt like I had made no progress at all. But then I would look back from the house and see a small, new patch of cleared land, and it was enough. I started a small vegetable garden near the house, in a plot my grandmother had once tended. I found her old gardening journals in the study and followed her advice, planting tomatoes, squash, and beans. When the first green shoots pushed their way up through the dark soil, I cried. It was a small, simple miracle. The community, in its quiet, rural way, began to embrace me. George, from the general store, would always ask how the tractor was running. The woman at the hardware store started giving me a contractor's discount without me asking. People would wave as they drove past my lane. They were watching me. They were rooting for me. Pioneer Holdings didn't go away. They sent more letters. They sent a slick, young lawyer in a suit who came to my door and talked about liability and zoning ordinances. He was polite, but his eyes were cold. He was trying to scare me, to wear me down. I listened to him patiently on my porch, offered him a glass of ice water, which he refused, and then told him my answer was still no. I was learning to be as stubborn as my grandmother. I wasn't just fighting for a piece of land anymore. I was fighting for a principle. I was fighting for all the names on my grandmother's list. I was fighting for a way of life that was being bought up and paved over. I was fighting for the belief that a home is more than an asset. It's a sanctuary. It's a story. It's a place to put down roots and grow. One afternoon, as I was repairing the fence line at the edge of the property, I looked back at the house. The sun was hitting it just right, making the new patches of primer I'd managed to apply gleam. The windows I'd washed were sparkling. A thin curl of smoke rose from the chimney. The fields I had cleared were starting to look less like a wilderness and more like a pasture. It wasn't perfect. It was still scarred and worn. The porch still sagged, but it was alive. It was breathing again, and it was mine. I thought about the girl who had arrived here months ago, the one sleeping in her car, hollowed out by fear and failure. She wouldn't recognize the woman I was becoming. This woman had calluses on her hands and dirt under her fingernails. This woman knew how to fix a fence and change the oil in a tractor. This woman was not afraid of being alone. My grandmother hadn't just left me a farm. She had left me a crucible, a place where I could be broken down and forged into someone stronger. The debt I owed wasn't to a bank. It was a debt of love and gratitude, and the only way to repay it was to live a life worthy of the sacrifice she had made. It was to become a woman she would be proud of. Home isn't a place you're given. It's not a set of walls or a roof. It's a choice. It's the place you decide to dig in, to fight for, to pour your own sweat and tears into. It's a commitment. My marriage to Mark had been a house, but it had never been a home. This place, this wild, broken, beautiful farm, with all its ghosts and all its burdens, was the first true home I had ever known. The fight with Pioneer is far from over. I know they won't give up easily. Mr. Davies has helped me find a pro bono environmental lawyer who is interested in my grandmother's research. The community is starting to talk, to organize. For the first time in a long time, the people here feel like they have a chance. My future is uncertain. I don't know if I'll succeed. I don't know if I can make a living from this land. There are 1,000 ways this could still go wrong. But for the first time in my life, the uncertainty doesn't feel like a threat. It feels like a possibility. It feels like freedom. My grandmother gave me a second chance, but I had to be the one to show up for it. I had to be the one to turn the key, to swing the hammer, to start the engine. We all get lost sometimes. We all have moments where we feel broken beyond repair, left with nothing but the wreckage of our past. But the end of one story is always the beginning of another. The question is, what will you build with the pieces? What second chance are you waiting to claim? What home, what belief, what love are you ready to fight for? If this story resonated with you, if it stirred something in your heart, please hit that subscribe button. And more importantly, share your own story of resilience in the comments below. Tell me about the time you started over. Tell me about the place you chose to call home. I promise you, I will read every single one. Because this space is for us. It's for the fighters, the builders, the ones who know that the most beautiful things in life are the ones we have to work for. We are all just trying to find our way back to a place we belong, and we don't have to do it alone.